If you're new to D&D, or your only exposure to D&D was, say, video games in the form of Baldur's Gate 3, and you maybe have played a little bit of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in terms of tabletop, well, you might be under the mistaken impression that D&D is basically the Forgotten Realms, this world that you're familiar with in terms of Baldur's Gate 3. Maybe you've heard of the infamous or famous Dark Elf Ranger, Drizzt Do'Urden, Elminster, all these characters, right? That's your impression. That's D&D. But in reality, it's not D&D. The Forgotten Realms, or Faerun, or Toril, however you want to term this world, well, that is but one setting among many, many others. The thing is, though, over the years, what has happened is that the Forgotten Realms has become the de facto default setting for D&D. For reasons beyond my comprehension, because I don't really love the Forgotten Realms, and I think it's fine, I just don't love it, it became the most popular setting. There are lots of novels in the 1990s and the early 2000s and so on and so forth, and so it is the face of D&D. But if you thought that was it in terms of D&D, you would be wrong. No, D&D has had a long and storied history of many different settings, some more successful than others, some more popular than others, but it has nonetheless had many different settings. You had, for example, a setting called Dragonlance, which was also on its face a so-called fantasy swords and sorcery setting, but in Dragonlance, the setting is really about the nature of good and evil, moral balance, the nature of faith and the gods, this sort of thing. That was the focus of that setting. You had Ravenloft, which is a setting all about gothic horror and just how bad things can actually get when you're living in a pocket dimension of vampires, undead, and other horrific, horrible things. You had the original setting of D&D Greyhawk, which was similar to Faerun or the Forgotten Realms, but a little bit more grim, a little bit more in your face. But most importantly, you had Dark Sun, which is the topic of this video. Now, Dark Sun came out in the early 1990s, and I in fact had made a video about 2 years back on this channel that actually did pretty well. It was remarkably popular by this channel standards at least, talking about Dark Sun as a setting and how cool it would be to bring it back and to have video games set in the Dark Sun universe. And I have to say, at the time, I was incredibly naive and perhaps even a bit stupid. I was correctly, I should say, reproached in the comments. Reproach might be the wrong word, but I was certainly pointed in the right direction by people who were saying, look, if they brought back Dark Sun, it wouldn't be Dark Sun. And lo and behold, what has been in the rumor mill for the past month or so, this happened last month, has been various allusions, adumbrations to the possibility that Dark Sun is on the horizon for D&D 5th edition. Why? Because WOTC, Wizards of the Coast, probably think that they can make money with it, maybe. But basically, the reason why we suspect this is that there were various subclasses, archetypes hinted at that used to be the bread and butter of Dark Sun. A gladiator fighter, for example, a defiler sorcerer, a warlock whose patron is a sorcerer king. I'll talk about that in a bit. A preservation druid, and so on and so forth. Now, this might be entirely alien to you, you're not familiar, but I'm very familiar with Dark Sun. It was my favorite setting. I read all the novels, I read all the material back in the day. And frankly speaking, I am terrified of the prospect of it being brought back. Because as the people who were illuminated and enlightened back then when I put out that first video said in the comment section, it wouldn't be Dark Sun. And this seems to be a sort of repeating theme here, is it not? That certain IPs or franchises are being brought back in a new format, be it video game or even tabletop, and it's just not really the same thing. You see, you have to understand that Dark Sun as a setting is incredibly problematic, to use the neologism form of that word. I don't mean literally problematic, but problematic in the, well, cultural wokeism sense, if you will. And the problem with Dark Sun in today's day and age is that the entire setting is predicated on things that are really, really nasty. It's by far the nastiest setting. To give you a bit of a nutshell introduction, I think it might be appropriate to simply read a passage from some of the original material, and you'll get a sense of this. We live in a world of fire and sand. The crimson sun scorches the life from anything that crawls or flies, and the storms of sand scour the foliage from the barren ground. Lightning strikes from the cloudless sky, and peals of thunder roll unexplained across the vast tablelands. Even the wind, dry and searing as a kiln, can kill a man with thirst. This is a land of blood and dust, where tribes of feral elves sweep out of the salt plains to plunder lonely caravans. Mysterious singing winds call men to slow suffocation in a sea of silt, and legions of slaves clash over a few bushels of moldering grain. The dragon despoils entire cities, while selfish kings squander their armies, raising gaudy palaces and garish tombs. This is our home, this Athas. It is an arid and bleak place, a wasteland with a handful of austere cities clinging precariously to a few scattered oases. It is a brutal and savage land, beset by political strife and monstrous abominations, where life is grim and short. This is an entry by the so-called Wanderer, a guy who used to wander the deserts of Athas way back in the day, and it gives you a little sense about what this setting is about. You see, Dark Sun is about, survival, basically survival. You have massive amounts of slavery, you have massive amounts of forced breeding, you have a system of arcane, i.e. wizardly magic that is predicated on the idea of destroying the planet itself. In fact, the reason why the planet looks the way it does is because a type of magic called defiler magic, that is wizardly magic that draws upon the essence of vegetation, sucked all the life out of the ground and out of the water and out of the earth itself. And it gets even worse because the reason why the world ended up this way, because it wasn't always this way, was due to massive genocidal wars waged against individual races, and so on and so on. Basically, Dark Sun is not PG-13 friendly, it's nothing friendly. It's by far the most brutal setting ever come up with, and the reality is that you could not revise this setting in a proper way that would reflect the way it used to be, that gritty, brutal, just agonizing nature of the setting, without severely changing things to the point where it would be unrecognizable. Because a setting is a reflection of the inhabitants it happens to host. And like I said, wizards, as an example, destroyed this planet by sucking the vegetation and sometimes the life force out of human beings. You also have, like I said, massive slave armies. You have these so-called city-states ruled by sorcerer kings who are defilers themselves. They have contributed actively, not just to the destruction of the planet, but to the genocide of multiple races. And they have gladiatorial games with slaves. They force breed dwarves and humans to create mules, which are basically half humans and half dwarves, and they're stronger than both in many respects. It is just a very, very nasty place. Now, there's something appealing about that. Not necessarily the amorality about it, that's interesting in itself, but rather, how did a world like this come to be, and how do you persist in such a world? Because the heroic stuff that you're typically going to expect in Forgotten Realms, or especially in a place like Dragonlance, etc., that's not in Dark Sun. Heroism is literally, defending a small oasis of water from a crazy tribe of 3 Kreen, which are basically giant insects, giant grasshopper people, who are carnivores and eat people, and it's just very, very different. It's a cool setting. I love it. It's my favorite one. There's a lot of rich history. It's fascinating how everything came to be, and yet it's not appropriate for the times. Well, the problem is, lords and ladies, that just as Forgotten Realms or D&D in terms of just being a general setting has been sanitized by Wizards of the Coast, Dark Sun will be sanitized too, to the point where it will be unrecognizable. So in normal D&D, you no longer have half races. You don't even use the term race anymore. Orcs are kind of friendly people sometimes, but sometimes not. And you just can't have that in Dark Sun. If you were to take away these brutal, malicious, and supremely grim elements, what do you have left? Because without the slavery, without the forced breeding, without the history, without the fact that it's a big deal, for example, in this world to even find a weapon made of metal, because these wars of genocidal destruction destroyed most of the resources of this world as well. So usually weapons, tools, armor are made of bone, or maybe obsidian, or maybe stone. If you find an iron weapon in Athas and Dark Sun, that's equivalent to finding a powerful magically enchanted steel sword in the Forgotten Realms. It's a big deal. And I just don't think the world is ready for that. And I also think that it's going to flop on its face, because what sold Dark Sun back in the day, what made it interesting and compelling as a setting, is something that Wizards of the Coast just doesn't have anymore. They can't offer it. And the new crowd that they want to attract is not interested in this type of grit and grimness anyway. Now, in the context of all this nonsense, there have been certain outlets of a particular political persuasion that have claimed that actually this is a good setting, and it will be very good to revise it and revive it because it's in fact inherently political, and that the sorcerer kings of this world are fascists, and that the slaves represent a communist uprising, and all sorts of nonsense like this. Look, of course there are elements that are kind of political. There are certainly environmental themes and undertones in Dark Sun, but people were not actively thinking about that. They were just thinking of, that's a cool setting. It's so different from everything else that's conventional. How can we make it? How can we play in it? That was the thought process behind it. And unfortunately, as everything is today, everything turns political, and you can't have nice things anymore. So all I can say is, please do not bring back Dark Sun. I don't think it's going to do well financially regardless, but it's going to be a blemish and a blight upon the past. I want to remember Dark Sun as it was, as the cool thing it was back in the 90s, and not some newfangled, I hate to say it, woke and or completely compromised project. And I just really, really hope this doesn't come to pass, because it's going to be ridiculous. And almost no one of the new generation will be interested in it. And on top of that, the older generation, my generation, isn't going to appreciate it either, because it's such a departure from the original. Anyway, my 2 cents there. Just wanted to talk about this a little bit, because I'm getting a little sick and tired of trying to revise old IPs and old franchises in the form of chameleons that are not actually the thing that they purport to be. It's very annoying, and it just ruins the fun and ruins, I think, ultimately, a work of art. And I think Dark Sun was a work of art, and they're going to take a big dump on it if they do this. But anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you like my content and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated. Helps out the channel a lot. I'll check you out next time.